I usually issue a disclaimer before I start speaking to tell people, I read the other day that if you're not good at a particular language, it actually only means that you know another language quite well. So I want to assure you, please don't judge me too harshly on my English. I do know another language quite well. Now, I've had an extraordinary experience over 19 years working alongside one of the greatest statesmen of our time, Nelson Mandela. I've learned from my experiences, and I don't have ideas to share, but I have experiences and a story to tell, and hopefully other people can learn from my experiences. But to put that in context and to really measure the impact on my life, I have to start at the beginning. I was born in 1970, that makes me 44 if you're not fast enough. In the apartheid South Africa, I was born in a little town called Boksburg. Now, before people were a bit shy to admit that they were from Boksburg, until Princess Charlene of Monaco and Charlize Theron both admitted being from Boksburg, and now we all freely admit we are from Boksburg. But shortly after my birth, my parents moved to a northern suburb of Pretoria, a very conservative community, and we happily lived apartheid. Being born in those years in South Africa, we were privileged just because of the color of your skin. We had access to education, we had access to basic services, health services, and we denied other people those privileges because of the color of their skins. So I never questioned my upbringing or the system that I was religiously following. There was never a need because I grew up in such privilege. I didn't know about the liberation struggle in my own country, and I was not interested in it because I lived a happy and comfortable life. So you can imagine in 1990, when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, when my father came outside to announce to me that the terrorist has just been released. I said, "Who's that?" He said, "Nelson Mandela." I said, "Oh." It didn't affect my life, and I didn't think it would affect my life. We were scared as Afrikaners because we expected Nelson Mandela to take revenge once he was released. We expected retaliation. So, well, in a very simple way, our lives continued, and I still didn't have to question the propaganda I was fed by the apartheid regime. You'll remember in those years that even the media was controlled by the apartheid regime, and there was really, therefore, no interest for me to ask questions beyond my own existence. So Nelson Mandela was released. I started inquiring a bit about what lay ahead, and we were all very scared. In 1994, I applied for a job in the presidency in Nelson Mandela's office. He was the first democratically elected president of South Africa. And I applied for the job thinking it's a junior position. I'd never meet him. I walked into his office and realized I may be close to the center of power. It was a very junior position, but it was in his private office. Still, I didn't think that I would have dealings with him. Then about 2 weeks into my job, I walked into his private secretary's office to deliver a note. And as I walked into her office, this crowd of people came walking out of her office. Immediately you notice men dressed in dark suits. They're all talking to their watches. They've got hearing pieces in, and you realize, okay, these must be bodyguards. And then he stood right in front of me. Nelson Mandela, the man my people feared at that stage, who would take revenge on us. He stood in front of me. I didn't know what to expect. I was immediately shocked. However, when you met him, the first thing you noticed was the sincerity of his smile, the kindness in his eyes. I could see he was visibly old, but he came across very generous. And then I started feeling responsible. I was overtaken by emotions. I thought, my people sent this kind man to prison. My people denied him 27 years of his life. And here I stand, and what he does is he extends his hand to me. And he starts speaking to me, but I can't understand him. And I had to say, "Excuse me, Mr. President," for him to repeat himself. And only then did I realize he was actually speaking to me in Afrikaans. Now, you feel like an idiot, but the last thing your brain expects is that the man that your people sent to prison would speak to you in your own language. And I subsequently heard him say over the years, when you speak to a man, you speak to his head. But when you speak to a man in his language, you speak to his heart. And that's exactly what he did that day. He destroyed my defenses by speaking to my heart, by speaking to me in my own language. I walked away and started learning that day about the liberation movement in my country and the role the international community played in bringing an end to apartheid, I slowly started appreciating the history of my own country. Now in 1995, the president called me into his office and he said, please sit down. And I immediately, if the president asks you to sit down, you think you're in trouble. And I said, yes, Mr. President. And he said, now I want you to go to Japan with me. And the first thing that came to my mind is, how will I explain this to my father? And I said, sure, I'm going to Japan. And he said, no, no, no. You could immediately see I'm misunderstanding him. And he said, I want you to be part of the delegation that travels to Japan on a state visit, some critical information I needed. And off we went to Japan, and what happens on a state visit is the head of state pays a courtesy call to the host, in this case the Emperor of Japan. And arriving there, we all got introduced from the most senior to the most junior person, so of course I'm right at the back being the most junior person. And when Mr. Mandela came to me, he said to the Emperor, and this is Zelda, and she's a real Afrikaner boeremeisie. And I saw, that the Emperor didn't really know what that was. And I thought that's a strange way of introducing me, but then I noticed that our entire delegation was representative of the population of South Africa. Every race was in that group. We were all there, and I was the Afrikaner. Now, what Mr. Mandela wanted to do or to achieve with that was to show the world a united front. Moving forward in South Africa, even the white Afrikaner people, would have a future in South Africa if you commit to the ideals of democracy and equality. And that's a choice someone puts to you. It's a challenge. And any person, you've got a choice. You walk away from that or you grab it. And I grabbed that opportunity, representing my people with both hands and repaying that challenge or answering that challenge with commitment, loyalty, and dedication. So I say to young people, if commitment, loyalty, and dedication could unlock this world to me, imagine what that could mean for you in addition to a good qualification, a good education and skill. That is how I ended up working for Nelson Mandela for 19 years. You can imagine people ask me, so what are the important lessons you've learned from him? And I'd like to tell you a few anecdotes by explaining how I got to these. The first is about discipline. Now, in the mid-90s, I was scheduled to fly between Johannesburg and Cape Town with President Mandela, and I arrived 5 minutes late one morning, or at the aircraft, and well, he was 5 minutes early, actually, which made me late. And I walked into the plane, and I could feel the atmosphere was very tense. And I thought I needed to lift this atmosphere, so I announced myself, and I said, "Good morning, Mr. President." He was reading his newspaper, strapped in, feet in the air, ready to go. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't say good morning. He just said, "That is the last time you were ever late. And I promise you, that is the last time I was ever late." That is the importance he paid to punctuality. A similar incident happened in Mauritius when he was chairing the South African Development Community meeting. And the plenary was in session, and about an hour late, President Mugabe arrived. Mr. Mandela interrupted the proceedings, which he hardly ever did, but it was the exception. He interrupted, and he launched into a speech of 20 minutes without mentioning President Mugabe's name once, but just explaining to people how disrespectful it was to be late. He said, "You as a president have no reason to consider your time more important than that of another person." So, of course, we all knew who he was talking about, but we all took the lesson from that. That is what the man was all about, discipline and respect. Which brings me to the third lesson, which is about respect. Second lesson, about respect. The South African Rugby Union challenged President Mandela during his presidency after he established a commission of inquiry into sports affairs. Now, it was a private body, and they felt that the president had no business interfering with the private body's affairs, and they challenged him to go to court. President Mandela insisted on going to court to defend his own decisions. We arrived in court that day, and Mr. Mandela walked right up to the defense, to the South African rugby union lawyers, shaking hands with them, conversing with them each in their own language. And I wanted to protest. I was still very young and I wanted to stop him. The people who've got the audacity to challenge his authority, and he walks up to them and he greets them. So during tea time, I confronted him. I said, "Why did you do that?" And he told me two of the most important things he ever said. "You never allow the enemy to determine the grounds for battle. And the way you approach a person will determine how that person treats you." And those things have stuck with me, and we battle with things every day of this nature, but then I'm reminded of these simple lessons that he taught me. The third lesson is about integrity and honesty. Now, we visited Kuwait in the year 2000, and if you were Nelson Mandela and you arrive in a hotel or a guest house, you didn't only get the basic toiletries, you got the entire range, and in this case, of course, very exclusive range. Little did I know that Mr. Mandela noticed each and every item in that bathroom. We went to pay a visit to the Emir, and upon our return, Mr. Mandela noticed that one of the items was missing. Of course, we left security behind to guard our rooms and our belongings, and he then insisted that I called the Commissioner of Police to fire all his bodyguards. I was trying to find out, why are we calling the Commissioner in the middle of the night from Kuwait? Why are we having them all fired? And I was more concerned about the fact that I wouldn't be able to get him home without security. So I was trying to diffuse the situation. And I thought if I just call the housekeeping, they could replace the item. He insisted on holding court in his room, and he became the prosecutor he was trained to be. He called them all into his room, made them stand parade, and I had to serve as a witness. And he said, "One of you are not to be trusted. And I want all of you fired unless the person who took that item replaces it tonight whilst we are asleep." And he was very serious about that. So, of course, the person replaced the item. And the next morning he did what he promised. He forgave and forgot immediately. Yet what was strange is we left that hotel that day without him taking any of those items, without opening it, without using it. Now that speaks to me of the man's integrity, of his honesty. And people ask me very often these days, so what would he have said about corruption? I'm sure you all read in the newspapers that we've got a flood of corruption in South Africa, and it's a very big challenge in our country's current system. And people ask me, what would he have said? And I say, I don't know. And I can't put words in his mouth. But that's how he felt about a stolen bar of soap. So make your own conclusions, draw your own conclusions. We need morality above populism throughout the world these days. Now, being in England, I'm also I'm reminded of Mr. Mandela's warm relationship with Her Majesty. We arrived at Buckingham Palace one day to pay a courtesy call to the Queen, and you walk on the red carpet, and as we approached the Queen, Mr. Mandela looked at Her Majesty and said, "Oh, Elizabeth, you've lost weight." Now, I don't think many people commented on the Queen's weight before, or even after, but the Queen laughed. They had a very warm friendship. They had mutual respect for one another. And afterwards, Mrs. Machel, Mr. Mandela's wife, said, "But Madiba, you can't call her Elizabeth." He said, "Why not? She calls me Nelson." So there was always, even through his humorous side, there was always respect. Respect is really the most important thing that I've learned from this man. He taught me that you don't have to exist at the expense of anyone else. Now, across the world and with events in the recent weeks, we know that freedoms that people like Nelson Mandela fought for are under threat these days. And we have to remind ourselves that history was determined by people with courage and conviction. And we can determine the future by displaying that same courage and conviction. Now, the last anecdote I want to share with you is about a visit to Saudi Arabia, and explaining to you how he related to people and how people revered him because he respected them so well. And on this specific visit, we had a free day, and Mr. Mandela announced that he would want to pay a visit to Mecca, just do a touristy thing. And I was busy organizing with the royal protocol, and when I excitedly asked him, so what time are we leaving for Mecca? And they looked at me and they said, you're not going to Mecca. And I thought it's because I'm a female, and I said, why not? They said, because you're not Muslim. I said, but he's not a Muslim either. So they were shocked. And it was really just a sign that they started believing, people across the world started believing he was part of them because he related to such an extent, with such respect, that he inspired respect from them as well. So in changing the world and dealing with the challenges we are faced with on the international stage right now, the reoccurrence of racism, I think of these lessons, and I think of discipline, respect, integrity, and honesty. Those are the things that made this man so revered for me, and how I see people reacted towards him over the years. What I can say to you is that one cannot fake authenticity. And I've seen his authentic side. I was witness to him waking up every morning wanting to change the world. And it was an authentic attempt, by one good deed at a time. Now, I want to share his favorite quote, or my favorite quote of his. No one is born hating another because of the color of his skin, his background, or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. Because love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. And I think that is a universal message. Doesn't only relate to South Africa. We will never condone the past in South Africa. We've had a terrible history. But the choices we make today, not only in South Africa but across the world, can influence the future. We can prevent something like apartheid, racism, by the choices we make every day and how we influence the world with our own courage and conviction. I'm lastly reminded of the thing I probably heard him say most often over the years. It's easier to change others than it is to change yourself. He said, I had to change myself before I could change others. So we can talk about discipline and respect and integrity, but we have to ask ourselves, it's a constant process, asking ourselves, have I changed sufficiently to want to change others? And therefore, for me personally, the lesson in all of this is, it all starts with me. I thank you.